So, learning to podcast, the what, the why, and the how, as I say. Um, so, what we will go through tonight is what is a podcast? You know, what makes a podcast such? Why would you want to podcast? And how do you make a podcast? So, before we get right into it all, I would like to know in the chat, or if you're happy popping your microphone on for a minute, I'd like to know if you have come already tonight with, a certain question, a burning question that you really, really want to know. If you've already got some experience, but there's something you don't quite understand, or if you feel there's something we might not cover in the general what, why, and how, then please do pop it in the chat, and I'm going to make a note of it here so that we can revisit that later on and make sure that we've covered what everybody wants to get out of this session. So, yes. Okay. I'd like to know about the hardware. Great stuff. Editing of the sound file. Yep. We will cover both of those things. So let me just make a note of them. So hardware to cover and editing. Now, I'm not going to go into a full-on tutorial of the software that's available at Makerspace, but I will show you all the basics that you need to do to be able to record something into it, edit it, maybe even put some music onto it and things, and then export that and turn it into a podcast. We've got a couple more. So advice on a recording device. Yep. Podcasts. Yeah. Okay. So Jill is saying that she's been asked to do podcasts, but all the previous ones we've done have been organised for me. So hopefully, I should be able to give you all the tools that you need to be able to do this yourself. Everything I'm going to cover is available at Makerspace for you to come down and use. It's free of charge for anybody who is a Makerspace and Library member. How to sync video and sound. Well, we don't tend to deal with a lot of video in the traditional podcast formats. So that's maybe something that I'll not necessarily cover tonight, if you don't mind, because I want to concentrate on the podcasting things. But what I would say is, if you are intending to video your podcast, then the video that you make will import into the software and the audio will already be synced up with it. But if we want to cover something else about video and sound, Leslie, I am quite happy to have a chat with you another time about that. If you have tools that you already use, but you want to know how to do it better. What else do we have? Getting onto a platform that hosts podcasts, we will definitely cover that. Online availability to music and sound effects. We'll cover that off briefly as well, but I will make a note of that because there are lots and lots of resources out there for online music and sound effects. So it's you can happily go on a big shopping spree, but there's a lot of free or royalty-free or license-free music out there that you can use. And where do you start with sound levels for recording? Okie dokes. Well, thankfully, most of the software in the computer systems will automatically adjust your levels for you. However, we will have a look at that as well. So, sound levels. Great. Okie dokes. Any more for any more, or shall we crack on? Yeah. Okie dokes. Right. So, what is a podcast? Excuse me. So, a podcast. Think of a podcast as your own broadcast or radio show. There are no hard and fast rules about it. You decide the length, what content you have in it, the format, as in whether you have guests on. It's all down to your personal preference. And there are some guidance as to what makes a good podcast and so on and so forth. But essentially, this is yours to own. And however you want to format it is up to you. It's usually a serialized or episodic content medium. So, as in you'll have, episodes 1 to 10 make up the first season and, so on and so forth. Or if it's, story style, then it might be one large story that has been serialized. And your listeners will subscribe to it via podcasting apps, which is where you will place your podcast. So listeners get notified when you have posted up a new episode, and that usually then downloads automatically into their device, which is more often than not a phone. Sort of 80% of people are listening to podcasts on their phone, probably higher than that now, actually. So they will always have your episode with them in their pocket, which makes podcasting such an easy to engage with medium. And if you have a message to get out there, it's a great way to do it. However, a podcast is not just made up of audio content. So you will often have, you will always have a cover artwork, and you will often have what's called show notes. So the cover artwork you'll use to tell people what it is they're listening to, as in what episode it is, maybe who the guest is, and so on and so forth. But the show notes are a detail and a description that go along with the episode. So you might use that just to tell listeners what's in the episode in terms of a description, but it's also the place that you can give people guests' details, you can place links in it, you can make references to things you've maybe discussed, and put web links onto that and so on. Or maybe even it's just putting your own contact details into it so that anyone that wants to get in touch with you can do so. So yes, the show notes you can see here, this is my podcast that I've been doing for a little while now. This was back from Series 2, Episode 4. I had a guest called Keith McKenzie. The podcast is called The Story So Far, and there's just a little bit of artwork there. And I change that every time so that I have whoever the guest is as a different picture and so on. And from one of the previous ones, this is the show notes. So I'm just telling people that in this episode I talked to this person, we have a great chat about this and that. We give their contact details and everything that they would like to put in there. And then I put a little thing at the bottom saying, if you want to appear as a guest, drop me a message. And that's the sort of thing that you need to use to prepare and give people as much information as you can before, during, and after they listen to the podcast. So some people might have a look at that beforehand, if you have a decent description of what you're doing, but they'll more often than not have a look at it afterwards to either get in touch with the person that was interviewed or to find out more information about something that you talked about. So, cover artwork and show notes. Why would we want to podcast? So what is the purpose of podcasting? If you've got any ideas on what the purpose of podcasting is or why you would want to do it, feel free to stick them in the chat, and we'll see what anybody thinks. So anybody, any ideas on why you would want to podcast? Like, what could it be used for? Tell some good stories. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, you could be telling stories. That could be actual fictional stories that have been written, or it could be someone's story. Informing people, yeah. Propagate information and marketing. Yes, that's quite important. Building a brand, Kate, yeah. Entertaining, educating, inform, support your brand. That's great. There's a couple coming here from a business point of view about supporting your brand, drawing people to your website, teaching people. Absolutely, absolutely. I didn't mean to come up with this as a piece of alliteration, but as I was sort of thinking about it myself, I kind of thought, well, a podcast really, it's for entertainment or education or exposure or evangelizing. And they're all sort of valid reasons for doing it, and that kind of covers a lot of what you've put in the chat there as well. But why you're really doing the podcast, why you're doing your podcast, might rely on the answer to the question, what do you actually want to gain from it? And that's kind of where podcasting splits into two factions almost. So you've got your business podcasts that have kind of been mentioned in the chat about building brand and pulling people to the website and so on and so forth. And then you've got the leisure podcasts. So business podcasts tend to be done to drive interest and footfall to the business. And it's a way of saying, we're the authority on this subject, and this is how we do business. And when you need it, this is why you should come to us. And it's not one big sort of advert or sales pitch. It's more about getting the personality of the business across. And what businesses usually want out of this is recognition and potential customers. So that kind of ties in with the whole building a brand or support your brand and bringing people to your website. You're looking for that footfall and getting interest in your business. So you're creating potential customers. But leisure podcasts don't need to have the same agenda or goals about them. You might well want to be seen as the authority on your subject, the thing that you're evangelizing about or the thing that you love most in the world, but not necessarily for business gains, maybe more for social exposure, kudos, or just to take people with you on a journey, with your, you might even just decide, I think other people would find it quite entertaining for me to be talking about this and have this type of guest on. I would just generally talking about whatever your thing is. It could be a leisure activity like golf or something like fishing, or it could be something with a larger following, like Star Wars or something like that, and it's just something that you're that is your thing. You're really into that, and so you would find a fan base of people listening to you. However, you do need to think about giving people a reason to listen, episode after episode, and build up that following. Because regardless of why you're doing the podcast, the idea of putting it out there is usually to get as many people to listen to it as possible. Whether you have a specific gain you want from that, business, footfall, or just a bit of kudos and a bit of, people recognizing that you're pretty good on this subject, it's important to have a reason for people to come and listen to you episode after episode. So let me move one slide on. I have a sort of planning sheet that I quite often give out to people, and it asks these sorts of questions. It's a sort of ask yourself, and the answers to it are quite important, and they help you guide how you're going to do your podcast, what format it's going to be, how long it's going to be, and so on. So the important one is, why are you doing the podcast? And it can literally be for any reason. If it's just because you want to tell people about your favourite thing, that's as valid a reason as anything. But who's your target audience for the podcast? As in, what kind of information are you going to have to give out for them to stay listening? Is there an age range involved there? Are they going to listen to certain types of guests but not others? What do you want to achieve with the podcast? Well, again, that might just be a bit of entertainment, or it might be footfall for a business and so on. What format will it take? Is it a monologue? Is it just you having a chat about your favourite thing? Whether that's a rant about something, or whether that's a evangelising, as I said, or whether it's just mulling over and musing things. Or are you going to do some interviews with people? Have you got like-minded people? Or are you trying to create a little bit of discussion and confrontation? Are you going to have people who don't think the same as you on every subject, and you're going to have a chat with them and create something that people are going to really tune in to find out, what argument are you going to get into next episode? And how often do you intend to podcast? The reason that's quite an important one is because right at the end of this presentation, I'll give you some top tips, and spoiler alert, one of them already is consistency of broadcast. So how often you intend to podcast has to be manageable for you. You might think, oh, it'd be great, I'm going to put out an episode every week. But if you do that for 4 weeks and then suddenly it's all got a bit too much and it's going to have to go fortnightly, that can cause a little bit of interruption in sort of listener numbers and things. Or worse still, it suddenly has to go monthly. So yeah, quite important to consider how often is appropriate for you and your life and what you can fit in and what you're doing, as much as it is, how often will people want to listen to this? And that can often have an impact on the length of the podcast as well. There isn't an ideal length of podcast as such, but there is a trend depending on what type of podcast it is. So somebody mentioned about educating and informing. Well, if you're doing quite an educational piece as a podcast, then maybe 10 to 15 minutes is long enough per episode. If you're doing, long form interviews with other people in industry and so on, then 40 minutes to an hour is not unusual. However, you tend to find that 40 minutes to an hour podcasts are released monthly, whereas maybe 10 to 15 minute ones are released weekly. And that's all to do with how often do you intend to do it, how often are you able to do it, how often are the listeners going to be able to digest what you're putting into your podcast. So that's why I said right at the start, there are no hard and fast rules. This is your product to own, but there are some serious questions to ask before you suddenly hit record and decide to put things out there. As I said, I have prepared a little questionnaire like that, which we can send out to everybody, that sort of helps you get started to go on the journey. If you've decided, yes, this is what it is I want to do, and I've got so many episodes I've thought about, and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, we need to think about how we're going to do it. So this comes to the part of the evening where I'm going to take you through some technical software. So excuse me while I take a drink. All right. Let me just have a quick look at the cameras. Have we still got people there, or are they all sleeping yet? No, everybody's awake. Good stuff. Right, great. Okay, dokes. Let us have a look at how you podcast. So essentially, there are 3 sections to the how you podcast, and they can break down into even further sections if you really want to go to town on them. But the main parts of how you podcast are recording, editing, and publishing. And if you take those 3 steps and just run them one at a time, and do what you need to do in each one, you'll have a podcast down in no time. So let's have a look at how we're going to record. Well, we'll have a quick chat about it first. So let's address a couple of the questions that came up earlier about hardware to use, and maybe even recording device, because we had them on the chat earlier on. So hardware to use. The simple fact is you could make a podcast on your phone. If that's how you want to get started, you could. I tend to shy away from recommending that, because what you really want to do with a podcast is achieve as good a quality as you can so that people are not put off listening to it. Podcasts have to be easy to listen to in terms of quality as well as content. So yes, you could sit with your phone and record your podcast, and then take it somewhere and edit it and turn it into an actual podcast and things. But it would be far simpler and much better quality to use software. And the software I'm going to show you is a Adobe Audition, which is available in all of the library makerspaces. It's part of the Adobe Creative Suite, which you can subscribe to, but it's available for you to use in the makerspaces. You can pop down. It's quite a simple program to get stuck into, but there's a lot of power behind it as well. Once you know what you're doing, you can go to town on it. But it allows you to edit and publish and so on and so forth. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So we were talking about, so hardware to use. Obviously, the first thing you're going to need is a microphone. These days, a tendency to use USB microphones is all the rage, and why not? There are some great USB microphones out there. You don't have to spend a fortune, but I would recommend budgets of sort of £60–70 upwards for USB microphones. The really cheap ones you might get from Amazon and things, really not worth the while. However, I'm going to keep banging on about the fact that you can actually just pop into the makerspaces and use their equipment to do it. The equipment, your microphones and software and computers and things, it's all available for you just to pop in and try out. And maybe that's the way you would want to go if you're trying out doing podcasting, and then you can take the plunge to invest in something if that's what you really want to do. So microphone, generally most laptops would be capable of it nowadays, but as I say, I think all of the computers, I'm right in saying, Kate, in all of the maker spaces would be perfectly capable of running Audition and being able to record and edit and so on and so forth. So the recording devices would be a slightly different way of doing it. So you could get an external device, just a recording, like a little dictaphone, or something a bit bigger than a dictaphone that maybe has a microphone input on it and things. But I think the bottom line about recording devices is you will always want to return to using software to edit and then publish your podcast. So I would really advocate, going down that route, spending a little bit of time in the maker spaces, just getting your way around the software, and making the best of it there, rather than trying to use a separate recording device, which is going to be a little bit clunky. It's not impossible, but a little bit clunky and a little bit tricky to edit things on, and then turn that into a podcast, because let's face it, eventually it's always going to have to go into the computer to be uploaded to one of the podcast apps. So, excuse me. Right, so I will ask at the end, because I think we'll have a little bit of time. I'll check at the end in with everybody who put some questions up and see if we've actually answered the question properly, because I know we've danced around a wee bit of that. But I think the message is, I would always advocate that you use software and, at the least a USB microphone. But if your computer is capable of doing more than that, then great. So let's have a look at the software that is available to use. As I said, it's Adobe Audition. Okay, so when you first open up Audition, this is how it looks, essentially, with lots of different boxes here, there, and everywhere. Now, I have enlarged the size of my mouse a bit in the hope that everybody can see this properly. But the good thing about Audition is that everything is perfectly customizable. So if we don't find ourselves using this box over here very much, we can just slide out the way a little bit, or we can even hide it out of the way. So it's worth spending a little bit of time and just experimenting with the layouts of the screen and things, till you make sure that you're comfortable with what you're seeing. So, what is Adobe Audition? Well, It is a digital audio workstation, or DAW, as they're commonly known. Lots and lots of them out on the market. As I say, Audition is part of the Creative Cloud suite from Adobe. Is a great, powerful program. It's much simpler to use than some of the other ones, and you can pop down to your maker space and try out. I'm gonna have to stop saying that soon on now. It's getting a bit ridiculous. Okay, so it's a digital audio workstation. It allows you to record, edit, and layer your podcast with music, an intro, an outro, whatever you want to put into it. It'll then allow you to get all the balance of the sound right and things, and then master that as one file, which you can then upload to your podcast hosting app. So until you're actually ready to publish something, this one piece of software is pretty much all you need. So let's have a look at it, and I'll take you through, and we'll record a couple of bits, and I'll show you just how simple it is. So when you first open it, as I say, there's a great big blank screen essentially here. We've moved some of the things out of the way that we don't use. And what we want to do is create a new multi-track recording, because we're going to have an introduction, we're going to have a main dialogue piece, and we're going to have some music on it and things. So we want multiple tracks to run that from. And when we click multi-track, we can call it whatever we want. So we're going to call it Podcast Test 1. We can save it wherever we like as well. Let's just put it into there. That'll be fine. And Audition has a lovely little set of templates with it. So if you're a musician that wants to do just a guitar and vocal piece that you want to record, then it'll open you a template with that. If you are doing video pieces and stuff, then you'll film sequence in stereo or surround or whatever. But they have this lovely little podcast one here. So we're going to open the template for podcasting, and you'll see why it's quite a beneficial one. And here we go. So I see in the chat, Leo's saying, how is GarageBand or Logic Pro for podcasting? Logic Pro is a step up from Audition. It has a slightly larger learning curve, shall we say, because it is so much more powerful. Logic Pro is the choice of composers for film and so on and so forth. So it does way more than you would need it to for podcasting, but it's possible to use it. GarageBand probably sits slightly lesser than Audition in the sort of how capable is it scale. You would manage to do a podcast on GarageBand because it can do multiple tracks, and that's the main thing you need. But Audition would allow you to grow with it, as in there are lots and lots of more facilities within Audition that you can use to polish up your podcast, whether that's adding your own music, or whether it's putting in effects on voices, or making sure that the balance is right and things. Audition is probably a better option, but yeah, don't get me wrong, you could definitely do a podcast on both GarageBand and Logic Pro. So now that we have our multi-track here, you'll see that it has created different tracks for us. So we have the host track, we have an interview track, sound effects, and a music bed. Now, that's not to say that you have to use them for these things. This is just the names that they've given them. But if we want to get stuck straight into it and say, I want to record part of an intro for this, you'll see that it has already also made us little markers for a 30-second intro, and then the main body, and then a 30-second outro. Now, we can move these around as much as we like, and they've just put them in there as a suggestion. But it does mean that you can sort of section it or compartmentalise your recordings, and you know what's where. So on each track, you'll find that you have an input section with the input arrow. So that's currently set to none. So I am going to put that to my microphone. And when I hit the R, that's going to activate the recording function. Now, it's not going to start recording straight away, but it's going to allow me to see the level that is coming in. So there we go. Every time I speak, you can see the level moving on the host track. Now, whether that's quite in time with what you're hearing or not, just kind of depends on the lag over Zoom. But it's working perfectly well from where I am. So I can essentially just hit the record button from there, and it will allow me to record a little introduction. So let's give that a quick try. So here's the record button down here. We'll hit record and it starts straight away. But it doesn't really matter if it starts straight away because I'm going to be able to edit that out quite quickly. So here we go. Hi, and welcome to another podcast episode of the Podcasting for Podcasters, or Podcasting for Podcasters podcast. Ever so glad you've tuned into this podcast. Enjoy the podcast. And there we go. It has recorded what I've said, and it's as simple as that to get it in there. Let's have a listen back to it. You should all be able to hear this, but it doesn't really matter if it starts straight away because I'm going to be able to edit that out quite quickly. So here we go. Hi, and welcome to another podcast episode of the Podcasting for Podcasters, or Podcasting for Podcasters podcast. I'm pretty sure I said poshcast in there. I'm not sure where that came from, but definitely podcast. So there's my introduction. Now I'm going to edit that so that it actually sounds as I want it to. But if I'd done it perfectly, all I might want to do now is click and drag that piece to wherever I want within the timeline. So the timeline you can see along the top here, this is it in seconds. And it only goes up to 3 minutes 40 at the moment, but it just gets bigger and bigger the more you record. So let's have a look at actually editing that bit. You can see how simple it is just to set up the input that you're using, which will normally come up with your USB microphone, for example, and then the recording option and hit record. However, as you saw, I made plenty of mistakes on that. So I'm going to zoom in a bit, and we can do that in a number of ways. We can use the little zoom button down here. Or if you see along the top here, we have a window, and we can make that bigger or smaller depending on how much of our track we want to see. So a couple of different ways to do things there. Now, we know that I kept talking before I actually wanted to do the introduction. But it doesn't really matter if it starts straight away because I'm going to be able to edit that out quite quickly. So here we go. Hi, and welcome. And there was a huge breath at the start of that as well. So all we really want to do is shorten all of this piece here. We want to get rid of all of this piece. Because that's not going to form part of our introduction. So as we hover the mouse towards the edge of the item, it turns into this symbol, and we can click and drag, and we get all the way to the end there, and then we can move the timeline, and let's have a listen to whether I've got it in the right place. Hi, and welcome to another podcast episode. So not quite, I'm still catching a bit of a breath there, but there's another way to change that around. However, before I finalise that, I'm going to try and get rid of this poshcast that I said and replace it. So let's just find that, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. And I'm also going to zoom in height-wise. There we go, so that I can see another podcast episode of the Podcasting for Podcasters. So this is it here. Podcasting for Podcasters, or podcast. Okay, so that section right there, poshcast. Podcasting for Podcasters, or podcast. Right up to where I say or. I want to get rid of that and just join the pieces back up again, so that it sounds like one take. So what we're going to do is we're going to find the piece that we want to cut at. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit more to see this. Postcast, yeah, that's it there. And I'm going to right click and I'm going to say split. Now you'll see that there are, keyboard shortcuts and so on for that. So when you get to learn the keyboard shortcuts and things, you can get around the software very, very quickly. But let's split that file there. So now I have two separate files. And I'm going to do the same as I did to shorten the start of it to get rid of this section that I don't want, which goes all the way up to here, podcasters, or up to here. So I'm going to take this edge, I'm going to move it right up to here. And then let's drag them back together and we'll see what the timing is like. Episode of the Podcasting for Podcasters podcast. So let me just do that a little bit more. Welcome to another podcast episode of the Podcasting for Podcasters podcast. Right, so there's a bit of a gap there that I need to join up, isn't there? Let's get to that point and drag them together. And if we keep dragging them, they do what's called a crossfade, which means that the two pieces of audio overlap each other, but the software automatically fades one in at the same time as fading one out. And that's called a crossfade, and it means that you can create fairly seamless joins in audio. So let's go back and listen. Episode of the Podcasting for Podcasters podcast. I think that's pretty good, but I'm going to listen to it back from the start, and we'll bring it back in so you can all see it. And let's listen to the whole thing and see if we've got that timing right. Hi, and welcome to another podcast episode of the Podcasting for Podcasters podcast. Ever so glad you've tuned into this podcast. Enjoy the podcast. Right, so I'm quite happy with that edit that I've made in between. I've managed to get rid of the nasty bit at the start with me chatting, and I've also managed to get rid of the poshcast bit and join it back up together. So you can see how getting rid of ums, ahs, breaths, mistaken words, that sort of thing can be done quite easily and quite quickly. So I'm going to show you a little bit about this start piece and how to get rid of that extra breath at the start and how to get rid of the breath in the middle. So if we double click on one of the audio pieces, it opens up in the waveform editor, which is where we really get to see in great detail how the waveform is. So we'll do this one first. And what we have is, if I go back to the start of it, but it doesn't really matter. Enjoy the podcast. I went too far back. It actually allows me to demonstrate quite well that what we're doing here is it's non-permanent editing. There is a technical term for it, and I can't for the life of me remember what it is. So if anybody knows, please stick it in the chat. But what it essentially means is we are editing what we see on the screen, but we're not completely destroying the audio file that we have recorded. So if we ever wanted to go back and open up that file again to make it a bit longer, or maybe we've accidentally cut out a word, we're always able to go back and put it back in without having to re-record. Non-destructive editing, that's what it's known as. Right, so this is the piece here at the start of my piece that I want to get rid of a breath from. Ever so glad you've tuned into this podcast. No, it's not. Hi, and welcome to... Yes, there we go. There it is there. So I still have this breath here. I'm going to highlight that and let you hear it. Hi, and so hopefully you hear that big breath at the start. Yeah. Hi there. So because I've highlighted that in the waveform editor, I can now turn up and down just the volume of this part itself. And that's really useful if you have one or two words that have come out really loud, or you have what's called plosives, which are the P's and the B's and the T's that tend to get over-exaggerated when people speak. Now, there's all sorts of far bigger, better software to be able to get rid of them automatically, but we can do a little bit of editing ourselves just to save a bit of time. So I'm going to turn down the volume, which they call amplitude here, because you're dealing with waveforms. So it's the amplitude of the waveform. I'm going to turn that right down, and you'll see it disappear. So now when I play that back, there's no sound at all. Hi, and welcome to another... There we are. So that's got rid of the breath at the start of that piece. Now, if I go back, if you look up here, we're switching between waveform and multitrack. So if I go back to the multitrack setting now, we should find that right at the start here, let me zoom in on it, we no longer have a breath at the start. Hi, and welcome to another podcast episode of the Podcasting for Podcasters podcast. Ever so glad I'm desperately needing to get rid of that breath as well. So let's open up this file and see. Ever so glad you've tuned in. Yeah, so that's the breath there that I want to get rid of. So I am going to highlight that just by clicking and dragging, and I'm going to turn the volume right down on it. So now, ever so glad you've tuned into this. Complete silence before I say ever so glad. And when we go back to the multi-track, and we play that from the start, we shouldn't have any breaths. We've got rid of the poshcast word. And we can adjust the timing a little bit more if we want. If there's too much of a gap between those words, we can get rid of that. But let's have a listen through. Hi, and welcome to another podcast episode of the Podcasting for Podcasters podcast. Ever so glad you've tuned into this podcast. Enjoy the podcast. So there's some nasty noises at the end of that as well, isn't there? Just as I sort of swallow or do something equally ugly with my voice. So let's get rid of the end of this. So we're going to shorten this again just by hovering until we get that symbol and move right to the end. And we should find... Ever so glad you've tuned into this podcast. Enjoy the podcast. And there we go. So I am going to do one last little piece because I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and that is I'm going to reduce the gap here between this part of the dialogue, podcast. Ever so glad you've tuned, and that part. And I'm just going to do it quite simply. I'm going to take the timeline and pop it there just by clicking along the top here. I'm going to right click. I'm going to split it, and I'm going to crossfade them. So I'm going to drag one on top of the other and just shorten that gap right out. And nobody's going to notice because the software is clever enough to crossfade the two bits of audio together. Podcasting for Podcasters podcast. Ever so glad you've tuned into this podcast. Enjoy the podcast. And there we go. An ever so fantastic introduction to my Podcasting for Podcasters podcast. Okay, let's zoom this out a little bit more so that we can see what's going on. And I'm going to close just by hovering in between the tracks. We get to the double lines that allows us to adjust the height of the tracks. So now that I'm kind of finished with that one, I'm going to move it up a little bit. And I'm going to decide, let's say we want some music to put underneath the introduction. Very common to have a piece of music underneath the introduction to your podcast, the sort of thing, and then for it to fade out as the body of the podcast begins. So I'm lucky enough that I write a lot of my own music, so I have a nice big stock that I can use whatever I need. But we will have a look at other music sources, which was another question that came up. So what about this one? So this is going to be, I know, much longer than I need it. But you'll see that all I'm doing there is this section of the software is the media browser. So anything I already have on my computer, or if I've brought it with me on a stick to the library sort of thing, then anything I already have, I can drag into the project from there. So it allows you to look through your drives, just as Windows Explorer or Mac OS does. You find the file that you like, and you click and drag it, and I'm going to place it into the music bed. So we'll drop that there, and we'll probably find that that's quite loud. So I'm going to turn it down quite a bit already so that nobody gets injured. And we will have a play of that. Yeah. Hi, and welcome to another podcast episode of the pod. So it's probably too loud for the voiceover that's there, and we'll look at how we balance out everything after we've arranged our podcast. But the first thing that we might want to do with this is to fade it in. And Audition makes that really easy for us to do just by looking at the waveforms and a few mouse clicks without having to go through any menus or anything. So we have these two little boxes. Let me enlarge this a little bit so that you can see it. And we have these two little boxes, this fade in box and this fade out box. And all we need to do is click and drag, and you'll see it draws the yellow line, which we can drag in to anywhere we want. We can also move up and down, which changes the type of fade in or fade out, which is not hugely important. However, one little tip is it's far more natural for our ears to hear a fade in at this sort of pace than it is to a straight. It becomes more important when we fade out. So this is clearly going to be too long for what we want, but let's have a listen to how that fades in now. Probably too long a fade in, actually. So let's drag it back a little bit and go back to the start. Yeah. Okay, dokes. So I'm going to move just by dragging my introduction piece along to here so that it starts as the music gets to its highest point. Hi, and welcome to another podcast episode of the Podcasting for Podcasters podcast. Okay. Ever so glad you've tuned into this podcast. Enjoy the podcast. And then I'm probably going to want to fade it out there as well. So it's clearly too long for the piece that we want. But all we really need to do is the same as we did with the speech, is we hover over the end of the music file, we see the little end cap icon, and we click and we drag and we take it probably back to here. Use your own judgment. We can fade out, so we're going to pull the fade out into there, and we'll have a listen to that and see if we're happy with it. Hi, and welcome to another podcast episode of the Podcasting for Podcasters podcast. Ever so glad you've tuned into this podcast. Enjoy the podcast. Now, depending on what content we're putting in after that, we might want the fade out on the music to be a little bit longer. We might want, we're going to adjust the volume of the music later on so that it lets the introduction through and things. But that's essentially, a basic let's create an introduction, and we can do the same again for the outro, which means that you can have the same piece of music, for example. Let's just zoom right out, and I'm going to copy and paste that piece of music, just as you would copy and paste anything from a Word document or a spreadsheet or anything. So we're going to right click on it and we're going to copy, and then we're going to place the timeline where we want, and we're going to paste it. And there it is. And again, I can move it around to wherever I like, but it's roughly in the outro. And Kate says, yes, can you save that intro and reuse it for every day? Absolutely, you could. You could save that just as your introduction. Saving is much the same as it is in any type of software that you use. We go up to the file menu and we save as, and you can save that session as your intro session. You can have the intro and the outro placed and then save that as a basic template for your own podcast so that all you're changing is the middle bit, the content. And yeah, it's a great idea to do that so that you have the same intro and outro for every episode, but the content changes in the middle. So yes, so here we go. Here's the outro piece. Exactly the same bit of music. But what we probably want to do is record ourselves doing a little outro piece for it. So I'm just going to place the timeline cursor where I want it. I've clicked the R button again for our host track, which now means that you can see the meters moving for my microphone. And I'm going to hit the record button. And that's the end of this episode. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope to have you next time on the Podcasters Podcast. Oh, goodness gracious. I'm making it up and I still lost my train of thought. Okay, so that's maybe not perfect, but I'm not going to waste all your time editing that again. Suffice to say that it's there as our outro. And that's the end of this episode. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope to have you next time on the Podcasters Podcast. There we go. Terrible as it is. Okay, so we now have our introduction and our outro, and as Kate brought up, we might well want to save that as... let's have a look, save as, and we might want to use that, call that intro and outro, and save that as a session which we can open up every time we want to do a podcast, and then we don't have to place all these things every single time. Anything you can do like that is obviously going to make your life a little bit easier, a little bit quicker, and all of these things add up to how often and how many podcasts you're going to be able to do. So, let's just say that the interview bit in the middle, we are going to do the same again as I did with the host track. So I'm going to pretend that I'm just recording it right now. I'm going to choose my input as my microphone, and I'm going to hit R for record, and I'm going to take the R off of the host one before I end up recording two tracks, and then we can begin recording from there. So let's get my timeline cursor, and wherever I place this cursor is where we're going to start recording. Okay, so if we want to do it in real time sort of thing, then we probably want to drop it in here. So let's have a go at this. So this is the very first episode of the Podcasters Podcast. I'm not very sure whether everybody's still awake or whether I'm just babbling on to myself. However, it's been an absolute pleasure, and we've only got another 3 hours to go. Thank you. So, whatever we've put in there is our content. And because it's so short, I'm just going to take the opportunity to drag these pieces, the outro piece and the outro music, and we're going to line them up there, and we're going to see... Probably want my music to start a little bit before the end of the content. So let's zoom in a little bit and see what we can line up there. So yeah, the music's going to start fading in just before we finish speaking here. And then we're going to come back in with the outro. So let's just play the end of this piece and we'll see how that sounds. However, it's been an absolute pleasure, and we've only got another 3 hours to go. Thank you. And that's the end of this episode. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope to... there we go. So that is a quick, less than a minute podcast, which is completely unusual. However, that middle content section is what dictates the length of your podcast, obviously. And you can see from there that although Adobe has given us a suggestion of 30 seconds for an intro and 30 seconds for an outro and things, it really doesn't matter. It's how long, how much information do we want to give at the start, how much do we want to give at the end, and as you can see, the markers that they've suggested and put in, this 30-second piece and this main piece, they don't have any effect on where you want to put your audio. So it's absolutely fine for you to completely ignore them and say, right, I'm gonna just do it like this. However, you can also click on the ends of these markers and drag them around. So if the main body starts here, then maybe you do want a marker there, just so that it gives you a visual reference. And the same with the outro. We could drag the outro all the way over here. But that's completely user preference sort of thing. It makes no impact on the actual using of the software or the audio that you have in it. So we have recorded our fake intro, a little bit of fake content, and our fake outro. We need to now make sure that that's balanced right. And up here we have this two different windows. We have the editor for the podcast session that we're doing, and we have the mixer for it. So if I click on mixer, you'll see that you get to see the different channels that we use. Now, we didn't use the sound effects channel because I didn't put any sound effects in it, but we did use the other ones. So you'll see the meters working on these as we start to play back. So here's the music. Hi, and welcome to another podcast episode of the Podcasting for Podcasters podcast. Ever so glad you've tuned into this podcast. Enjoy the podcast. So this is the very first episode of the Podcasters podcast. I'm not very sure whether everybody's still with a little bit of manoeuvring of these knobs. Essentially are what's called faders, which means that they fade in and out the volume of your music, or the volume of your dialogue, or volume of whatever is on that channel. Now, there's lots of other things that you could do on here. Adobe has a lot of clever presets about automatic noise reduction and getting rid of all the lip noises and the horrible noises that I make when I talk. It has some great stuff to be able to do that, but that's quite in detail, and it's the sort of thing that there are some fabulous tutorials built into Adobe as well. When you first start up, you're presented with a choice of tutorials which you can ignore or you can go through, but there's some great stuff there for you to pop in, sit down in front of the computer and have a look through them and really get to know all the other fantastic things that you could do to give yourself a little bit of extra polish. But if we're happy with this as a basic setup, what we're going to do is turn that into one file, which then allows us to publish it as a podcast on the web. So I would imagine most people are familiar with the format of MP3, which is pretty much how everybody accesses their music nowadays. So everything that you stream, everything that you listen to, or everything that you download tends to happen in MP3, which is a compressed audio format. It's not exactly the same quality as we used to listen to on CDs, but it's still a little bit more dynamic than cassettes or even vinyl. Dare I say, considering I still have a cassette player and a record player over there. However, what we want to do is essentially create one MP3 file that can be sent out to the world. So the whole purpose behind MP3s was to reduce the size of the file so that it meant it was very easy for people to access. And that's exactly what we want from podcasts. So to be able to do that, we go up to File, and instead of saving the session, because all that's going to do is save what we've actually done. And let's face it, we would be doing that anyway as we go along, just as we save documents or spreadsheets or anything else that we work on. We want to actually export this. So export, and we want to export a multi-track mix down, which is basically, if you remember, this was called a multi-track. Right at the start, we created a multi-track. And the mix down of that is essentially saying all of the tracks that you have in your multi-track, I will mix them all together and we'll spit out one file. And we're going to do the entire session because it's everything that was in there is what I want. So then we get to name it and so on, just as you would do with any kind of file that you're saving. So podcast test 1 mixdown MP3. You can choose different file formats that you want to do. You can do it as lossless waves and so on and so forth. But to be fair, everything that you tend to access as a podcast listener is done as an MP3 and streamed to you at whatever best quality it can. Because that saves on space and it saves on bandwidth when you're listening live to something. So there really isn't an awful lot of point, I don't believe, in making a podcast that is super high quality, because the people listening to it are not going to receive it at super high quality anyway. So let's leave it as MP3, and we will just click OK at that. And I'd obviously already tested this, so I'm going to overwrite that file, and it's going to do that. And I'm also going to just save that session so that we can always revisit if we need to. And yes, there we go. Right, so I need to now find a way of getting that file that I created, which is in I know you can't see this, but I'm just finding it here. Here it is. Right, I'm not sure if you're hearing that.
And welcome to another podcast episode of the Podcasting for Podcasters podcast.
You can see there's nothing.
Ever so
playing
glad you've tuned into
Adobe.
this podcast. Enjoy the podcast.
So that's me playing back the file that we made. So what we're going to do now is find a way to spread that out to the world and let them all hear exactly what we're going to do. So we have done the record, the edit, and now we need to move on to the publish. So there are plenty of podcast hosts out there for you to choose from. You don't have to do any of the grunt work, shall we say, yourself. You don't have to upload to every single different podcast app that's out there, and so on and so forth. But you will want to try and encourage people, emailing them or social media and so on, to let them know where it is. But there are easy ways of getting your podcast onto all the popular sites like Apple and Spotify, and all of these other ones here are really popular podcast apps. And then you can also have it on Google and so on and so forth as well. So we'll check out a couple of these to see which might fit you best. Obviously, as with most of these things, there are free options and there are paid options. You obviously have to sign up for an account as per every other thing in the world nowadays. But it doesn't have to cost you anything to put out a podcast. And you don't have to pay extra to necessarily have it on Apple or Spotify or anything. Podcasting is becoming such a large medium now that the sites that help you do that tend to make their money from advertising and things. So there are free options for you just to be able to distribute your podcast, sorry. So a couple of my favourites out of here are Acast and Anchor and Podbean. And with any of them, you're able to then set up your podcast and it will automatically distribute through a lot of the other networks. So let's have a look at that now. So I'm going to stop sharing this part of the screen and I am going to attempt to share a different part. Okie dokes. Yep. Okie dokes. Right. I'm going to move that out of the way. So, this is the Acast website. And when you create yourself a little account, I've just done one for me here, Kerr Mathieson, this is how it starts up. And you want to create a new show, or you can import an existing show. Now, I won't go into too much detail about that, but it's essentially wherever you create your podcast, all the different hosting apps have a nice little clever way of you just being able to port it over to them. So if they want your business, they make it as easy as they possibly can. However, we're not importing an existing show. We're going to create a new show. So when we click on that, this is all the details about the actual show itself. And this is where things like the show notes and the description and things come into play. So we might want to upload a cover photo. Let's see if I can choose a particularly good one. What about oops, sorry. Let's see if that will go up in there. Right, there we go. So any old cover photo would do, but this is the cover for your show itself. So this is what's first displayed to people when they go onto a podcast app and look for your show. Every other episode can have its own cover, so you can then use that to be able to show people what's happening on that episode. So let's just call this the podcast test. It's an episodic podcast. It doesn't contain any explicit material. And this here is a custom URL, if you like, as in a custom website that you can point people straight towards. To be fair, I find myself very rarely using anything like that, because once the word is out there that your podcast is on X site or Y site, Anchor, Spotify, whatever it might be, people tend to access it from there. They will rarely ever use an actual URL for a website to go and find your podcast. But you're always supplied with one anyway, so that you can do that. So we can give a quick summary on here of what our entire show is about. So this is just a podcast test show, if I could spell correctly. There we go. And if we want people to be able to discover the show, then we can use categories and keywords and things. So category, let's just put it into the arts. But there's lots of different categories that you could use there, whether it's news and politics or sports or health and fitness, all of these sorts of things that you can categorize it as, so that when people are searching for new podcasts, they know where to find yours. Keywords we might put in, tests, or if it's about Lego, we might put in, Lego and Lego Star Wars and all sorts of different types of Lego in their keywords, so that when people search again, they find your podcast quickest. Then it has the author details, which it has pulled just essentially from the account details that I made up. And then we have a couple of advanced settings there. So the advanced settings, I will just say this about this email. You will find this on every podcast app, and it's quite important. I don't know why they've used obfuscate email. Why couldn't they just say hide email? However, normally, you don't want to hand out your email address left, right, and centre to people. It just encourages spam and so on and so forth. However, when it comes to podcasting, you are supplied with what's called an RSS feed, which is essentially a little bit of code address that every other podcast app is able to read from. So when they read that address, they know how to point their customers to your podcast. And this is how people like Acast and Anchor are able to get your podcast onto Apple and Spotify and so on. Now, normally you would say, well, I don't really want my email put in with all of that, because that sends my email around to everyone. However, Apple Podcasts are very, very reluctant to accept an RSS feed and publish your podcast on Apple unless it has a verified email address built into the feed. And so that's what this is about, and this is why it's set to off automatically, is because really, to protect your privacy, you would switch that on and say, I don't want my email address out there. However, to give it the highest compatibility, leave it off, and you've got a much higher chance of it automatically appearing into Apple and so on. There we go. You can have ad settings and so on. Some of the hosts, as I said, they make their money from advertising. They will, if you allow them, place their own adverts on your podcast, either at the start or the end and so on and so forth. You won't necessarily make any money from that, I'm afraid. That is their way of paying their bills. However, they don't force it upon you, and you can see that by default, these are all set to 0. Number of airtime ads, number of sponsor ads, and so on. But you can look into that yourself if advertising is something that you don't mind. So we're ready just to save that show as it is, and then we can start to build the episodes around it. So there we go. So this is my show, the podcast test, and I can start off just by creating a new episode. So when we do that, new episode, this is where we want to drop in the audio file that we made from Audition. So let me do that now. There we go. And it takes a few minutes for it to upload it. It's nothing like as long as YouTube and things to upload and encode and all the rest of it. It's usually quite quick. So here it is. It's already in. And you should be hearing that. Hi, and welcome to another podcast episode of the Podcasting for Podcasters podcast. You know that's there. You can now say, okay, so this is a podcast test, episode 1, and the subtitle is, just a test. It's season 1, and it's episode 1, and we can put another cover in there if we want, another cover sheet, cover picture. It's quite handy to be able to use maybe some of the other Adobe products to make up nice little covers and things, make up little pictures just to put in. As I said, the one that you saw in the presentation earlier is something that I just put together from different pictures. So let me see if that one comes up. So you might recognize that arm there with the thing, it was actually part of the cover for my podcasts. So yes, chopping all that up and making nice episodes, putting titles on it and so on and so forth is great, so that you're telling people what's there. And this is where the show notes come in. So if you remember way back to like an hour and a bit ago, and I talked about show notes and things that are not just audio putting into podcasts, this is where we put that sort of thing. So you might say, that in this episode, I talked to other podcasts about the podcasts they're creating and how they go about doing it. If you want more information on Kate, here is her email address. If you want more information on me, here's my website. Anybody who wants to get in touch, you fill it with as much information as you can, because it also counts towards the search. The let's not get too bogged down in SEO and all the sort of, where you'll rank in Google search and all the rest of it. But it does contribute to that. So if somebody is searching for a particular guest or a particular podcast, the more information you have in here, the more likely your podcast is to pop up. So we would do all of that, and we say, do we want to, does it contain explicit language? Doesn't. And this is where we get to the point where we say, right, are we ready to publish, or are we scheduling this? So if we are ready to publish, we would just press the Publish Now button at the bottom. If we want to do it on a later date, then publish on a later date and open the calendar and we can choose whenever we want to. So if you want to do your podcasts every Tuesday at 8 o'clock, then great, that's what you do. Schedule them for that time. You can upload them anytime you like and just schedule them for release at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday. So I'm just going to save that as a draft. And I'm going to have a quick look on the show itself and have a look at this distribution tag. Now, Acast, for some of these, will make an extra charge. So you would have to have what's called a pro account to be able to do. But Anchor, for example, doesn't have any charge at all for you to distribute to Apple and Google Podcasts. Amazon Music they only recently added podcasts to their facility. Is proving very popular. Stitcher, you might remember the picture that I had up that had the Stitcher on it, Spotify, so on. So you can essentially go along this and click and decide exactly which ones you want to distribute it to, and it will automatically send that RSS feed that I talked about, which you don't have to know an awful lot about, and it is quite technical, but that is how they distribute that to other sites. So you see yourself that once you've uploaded your podcast episode and you've done the hard work of the show notes and the artwork and so on and so forth, you don't have to then, thankfully, go on and do everything about, okay, I've got it on one site, now I have to put it on this site, now I have to put it on this site. Oh gosh, still haven't got it on Apple. We need to get it on. There's none of that now. Choose the right podcast host for you, depending on if you're doing it free or chargeable or whatever, and you'll find the distribution goes pretty smoothly. I've never really had a problem. Some places will take longer than others. Apple is pretty bad in terms of their timing. It took 2 weeks nearly from my original launch of my podcast for it to appear on Apple, and yet it had appeared on everything else within 2 or 3 days. So sometimes patience is a virtue for sure, but the hard work is already done for you. So let me stop sharing for a second, and let's just have a look and see whether we have covered off just about everything we need to. I have one last slide to show you, so let's do that, because seeing as we're getting near the time. Here we go. Right, so one last slide. Top tips. So if we've gone through everything about how to record and edit and publish, top tips for making a successful podcast. I mentioned earlier regularity of episodes, which really helps to maintain your listener base. So make sure that you're trying to do whatever is suitable for you. Now, it's not a disaster zone. Over last year's lockdown, I was doing weekly episodes of my podcast. My podcast is 45 minutes to an hour long, but I was managing to do weekly episodes of it. Suddenly, when we all came out of lockdown, that was no longer really applicable, because I was able to gain more work, which took away from the time of podcasting. How dare it? However, I had to switch to fortnightly, and really it wasn't a great deal for people. It wasn't a huge deal because I'd been doing it for a good few months weekly by that point. It is a big issue if you need to do it within the first few weeks. If you set yourself a target of doing it weekly, and then 3 weeks down the line it has to go to monthly, people are uncomfortable. They don't know what they're doing. I don't know if she's still here, but that's Jill saying thank you very much, has to go to work. Thank you for coming, Jill. I hope you got everything you need out of it. So a few last top tips. Publicity through your social media. Absolutely the most powerful thing you can do is publicize your podcast through all your social media. So that might be set up an actual Facebook business page just for your podcast, or a Facebook page for your podcast. It might be set up an actual Twitter account for your podcast. Don't do it just through your own Facebook feed or Instagram or Twitter. Really think about setting for it, so that it has its own identity and it has something that you can really push out. Also lets you see how many people are actually interested in following your podcast as opposed to just you. Teasers and trailers are a great idea to start off with. 1 minute, 1 minute 30 is great just to give a bite of what you're discussing on this episode, or maybe when you're starting off, just doing a little bit of teasers about what you're going to talk about and things. It's also very useful because of the time limits of Instagram videos, Facebook videos are not so bad, but Twitter videos and things. If you want to put them on natively, they have very short limits, an hour and a minute and 20, I think, is Facebook, but is Twitter. But I'm sure somebody can correct me. And have one in the pocket. What do I mean by that? Essentially, if you can, be one step ahead all the time. Already have an episode done before you publish the one previous. So let's say, for example, make 2 episodes before you publish number 1, so that you're always making episode number 3 before you've even published number 2. And it allows you to both have a bit of breathing space, so that, if something goes wrong that week, you've already got one made that you can put out, and then, yes, you're playing a bit of catch up, but at least you're not missing an episode anywhere. But also allows you to talk about your next episode. You might mention that at the end of the first episode. Join us next week because we're going to be talking to such and such, and it's a fantastic episode. Absolutely loved every minute of it. So yes, just a few top tips around getting the best out of your podcast once you've actually got making it. And that's just about us. Thank you for everybody for staying as long as you did. I honestly didn't think it would take this long, but I do like a bit of a chat. So there we are. I can always be found at audiooutsource.co.uk. On there, you can even book in a quick 30-minute chat. So, that's absolutely free of charge. 30-minute chat just to go over something if you want. If you need some more information or you want some real technical detail. And that's the website, culturepk.org.uk, and you can scroll through that from there to find all the details about Makerspace and everything that's available. I better give Kate a couple of minutes before we get to the end.
Hello. Thank you so much, Kerr. That was amazing. My mind is kind of blown. I'll give everyone an opportunity to maybe pop any questions into the chat box if anybody has a burning question for Kerr. But also, I wanted to say that we are planning to run a follow-up event to this one. And so whilst I have you all here and everybody's all feeling like inspired and ready to go, I thought I would mention it. It's going to be run by Kerr, and it's going to be like a hands-on practical session where you can come into the Makerspace at AK Bell in Perth, use our kit, and get Kerr to talk you through the whole process. Obviously, because the libraries are shut, I don't know when this will happen. It will happen as soon as we can open. It's likely to be 2 half-day sessions, and it will be free, like this one has been free. Because it's likely to happen under social distancing rules, it's going to be for a really limited number of people, like maybe 4 or 5 people might be all we can fit in. So what I'm going to ask just now is I'm going to put a link into a survey, just like a super quick three questions about how you felt about this evening. But also there's an opportunity there to pop in your email and your name if you would like to be notified when we're ready to book in people for that class, because spaces are limited, and if we can have people who've come from this first session, then obviously that would be lovely. So I'm going to pop a link in the chat, but do let us know your name and your email address, and we will let you know when we're ready to have that session, and hopefully we'll get everybody booked in. Yeah, okay, thanks. Is there questions here for Kerr? Everybody seems impressed though.
The one thing that we didn't really cover was the online music and how you source music for it. The best advice I can give you is to Google search royalty-free music. It will bring up so many different sites, and you could spend hours listening to thousands of royalty-free music that's available for you to download. there's also YouTube have their own royalty-free music section as well, which is always useful. I would always advocate you go out and pay a musician to make you some music, but that's not always possible. So yeah, there is an absolute plethora of music available out there. Do a search for royalty-free music, and have a look at the different sites. A lot of the different sites will have different types of music on them, so you might find one that fits your bill just right, and that becomes the popular place for you. Yes, I think that just about covers it all, unless there's anything else.